Hi, we begin today the exciting story of Jacob's journey back to the old country to encounter his uncle Laban, and it's going to be 20 years till he gets out with 2 or 4, we'll see, wives and a whole slew of children. So, as we enter into this, I encourage you to watch the introductory video posted just before this one if you haven't watched it, where I go over a number of issues that are involved in this story. I'll touch on a couple of them now, but there's more depth in the introductory video. One of the things we've been looking at since chapter 25 is the shape of the Jacob story around 3 units. We've already seen the Jacob and Esau encounter around birthright and blessing. We'll return to Jacob and Esau together in the other side of that story, and now we're in the middle with Jacob and Laban. And it's not surprising that we'll see a whole series of chiasms in our unit, because the whole story is very circular, as Jacob and Esau revolve around each other here, and in the middle Jacob and Laban revolve around each other, and Jacob will come back to where he started. So it's not surprising to see these chiasms I looked at last time. There's this larger chiasm that covers all the way from 28:10 to 31:18, and then we'll see a couple more smaller ones that overlap each other in the latter part of chapter 31. And in the center of this section around Rachel and Leah, we see that whole unit is its own little ABCBA chiasm. So we're going to be in this little chiasm here throughout this story, the next 2 videos, and Jacob's introduction to being in the old country in the next one. And as I again looked at in the introductory video, I won't go over it in detail now, but it's important that starting today in this immediate scene, but throughout this unit, that we recognize there are at least 3 interpretive foci to go through. One is the immediate plot that we're seeing, the character of Jacob escaping from his angry brother in search of a woman in the old country. But there's also, as we saw back in 25, in the oracle that his mother received, 2 nations are in your womb. So at one level, this is going to be about Jacob, who will become Israel in the chapter after this, in chapter 32. And this scene is all about exile. And of course, returning in Mesopotamia is exactly where Abraham came from, but also an expression of the exilic context of so much of what Genesis is about. But there's also the post-exilic expression. So these are both expressions in the story itself, but there's the post-exilic expression, and that's going to become very important in today's and the next videos around the question of the relationship between this story in Genesis and the story of Josiah and Bethel in 2 Kings 23. As I noted previously, this whole unit can be read as an allegory about the monarchy. I won't show that again now, but we'll come up to it. We'll look at it more when we actually encounter Laban and Rachel and Leah and see how this story is in many ways a counter story to the whole notion of monarchy, with Laban as a stand-in for that. As we look at our immediate scene, and I've been noting not using whole chapters for keywords here because the chapter markers aren't really helpful. Here, this is plainly starting a whole new unit, and so I've put it up just this part of it. And as we'll see, there are some keywords that might not seem like keywords, but one of the keywords is what seems like an ordinary word in English, place. It's makom in Hebrew, but it's 3 times in this immediate first verse, really drawing attention to it. And the video we'll do next time in the second half, in this part down here, it's 2 more times, hear from the voice of the narrator and hear from the voice of Jacob. And as you can see from this little comparison, it isn't just an ordinary word, it becomes the cipher for Jerusalem amidst the Deuteronomistic historian's perspective. So starting with Deuteronomy, as you can see here, but also in the Ezra-Nehemiah text, which is the continuation of the Deuteronomic perspective in the post-exilic period when Persia sponsored the rebuilding of the temple. And that's all about Jerusalem being the place where Yahweh is. And as we'll see in today's video and in the next one around this story, Genesis is offering an alternative. The God of creation can be experienced anywhere and everywhere without mediation of the priests in Jerusalem or any other institutions such as monarchy. And so that's the radical version of Genesis that we see in a number of places, starting in Genesis 1, of course, with the equal presentation of everybody in all creation as good and all humans being in the image and likeness of God. And we'll also see that in the echo from the second half, that what Yahweh promises in this dream is exactly what Jacob asks for or makes conditional, what God has already promised. So we'll see the nature of Jacob's vow to question whether God will actually do the things that God will do. So his faith will be at issue after the theophany experience he has here. An element that we see already in the immediate beginning of this, because the sun had set and he's going to dream, is the role of night, sleep, and dreams. And I color-coded those in sunny colors to contrast that. And as Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg has noted, and I'll point this out as we go, the sun sets here and it rises in 32:31. We can see that there after the wrestling scene. So one could really frame the whole story all the way to 32. Again, there are overlapping chiasms and shapes, but I framed it this way through end of 31 to highlight the time going to Mesopotamia and out. But the journey back to Esau certainly involves some of the echoes, and that's what really completes this whole unit when the sun had set here and it rises there. So really, in between all these stories, it's symbolically night. What Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, a Jewish Israeli writer, writing about a Hebrew language text, refers to in Christian terms as a dark night of the soul, an image from St. John of the Cross, the great Spanish mystic. And so Jacob, not knowing St. John of the Cross, of course, or Christian mysticism, though, in Gottlieb Zornberg's perspective, is having his deep spiritual experience here and being tested on what he really believes. And that's what will be at issue in our immediate first scene here. Okay, so with no further ado, let's put up our keywords and let's jump right into our verses, and we have a couple more things to look at as they unfold. So I can go back up to verse 10, but all that tells us he left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And as I was noting in the introduction, that's contrary to what his father told him, which was to go to Paddan Aram. So his mother told him to go to Haran, and his father told him to go to Paddan Aram. And yet it says he goes to Haran, obeying his mother's voice and not his father's. So he came to a certain place, and as you can see, even this little unit here from 11 to 19 forms a nice little chiasm around these individual words. So tightly structured scene here, as you can see. So he came to a certain place, or literally encountered. It's not just the word for coming and moving around, it's an encounter. And we see that only in 23:8 with Abraham and the Hittites there, and in 32:2, which is the wrestling scene that we'll come to. And a certain place, it's not a certain place, it's literally Makom, the place. And that's important, because when we look at the map, we realize he hasn't gone very far. He's only gone from Beersheba to here. And when this story is over, he'll suddenly be all the way up here in Haran, as if it was just a breeze to get these hundreds of miles by himself there. But we have to pay attention to the fact that the writer is pausing only in this one place. And so it was called Luz, as we hear and the map shows, but then Jacob calls it Bethel, and we'll see Jacob calls it Bethel again in chapter 35. So it's really important, and that's where we're going to engage the story of Josiah in 2 Kings 23 around the role of Bethel and why this place. But as I've noted, it's referred to 3 times in this verse simply as Makom, as the place. He came to a certain place, stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place, which is obviously awkward in English, and normally, a person wouldn't write that way unless they're trying to say, do you hear the word Makom here? And that is the focus. So he stayed there for the night, using a word we've seen a number of times, but especially ominously around 19:2, when the visitors to Sodom offer to spend the night in the square, and he begs them and cajoles them to go into his house, which doesn't work that well either, but that's an urban setting, and this is plainly not an urban setting. Although, interestingly, it is an urban setting, even though it's not described that way. He stayed there for the night because the sun had set. We only saw the sun previously in the theophany that Abraham had, also at night, around the cutting of the animals in half for the theophany there. So the sun had set, again matching the sunrise, and there's the point about Viva Gottlieb Zornberg that I made. And notice it's not just a rock, taking one of the stones of the place. And I noted here in the structure and themes the stone theme that we see here, and also I'll leave that up as we can see. And it's repeated several times, not just in this immediate scene, but to highlight the reference to this particular stone. So in the next video, we'll hear the echo. He took the stone that he had put under his head, and then in 22 at the end, this stone which I have set up for a pillar. So here from the head to the pillar, and here from the pillar to the note again. Then there'll be the stone around the mouth of the well that focuses there. But at the end in 31, we see Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar and said, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap at the same place. And so we'll see that this stone theme has a lot to do with this story, echoing in an opposite way the Babel story. And thanks to the work of Matthew Michael, whose article you can see cited here, here's his chart that I've taken from this article showing the numerous parallels between the Babel story and this story here. And the most obvious elements are that people are trying to build a tower up to the sky, and here something comes down out of the sky and appears, or at least it's in a downward focus. And I won't go over all those details, but certainly one of the elements is the Tower of Babel story comes right after the genealogy of the Table of Nations, and at the center of that, not quite the center, but the key point in that in 10:8 to 10:10 is the establishing of the great city by Nimrod there, the one specific element that's among the distribution of all those nations by seemingly ancestors of the one person. And so as all the peoples of the nations went out and tried to become unified by building a tower, here we'll see the story of Israel, a series of 12 sons that we'll see that make up them, going to be unified by not building a tower, but by recognizing the God of creation. So one of the deep elements that's involved here. But we'll also see how it's contrary not only to the Tower of Babel story, but to the whole Deuteronomistic history, making the focus on Jerusalem as the key element. And that's again what place is playing out against. So taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head, and as others have said, it's not as a cushion. Plainly, a stone isn't a pillow, but suggesting it's as a protection, that it keeps his head being protected from something that would come from behind. But is that really the point? Is that really protection? Is this stone protecting him from anything as he's lying down all by himself in a strange place, and we don't know anything that's around? We have no description of this place at all other than it's night. And we won't find out till after the theophany here that it's a city, or there's a city nearby, but there's no evidence of any city. He's plainly not just lying on the ground in the middle of a city. There'd be no occasion for that without mentioning it. And notice how vulnerable he is here without expressing any concern. We don't hear anything from Jacob that, oh my God, this is dangerous for him to be out here. We don't hear from him at all. We just hear from the narrator what he did. So let's scroll down and look at a little more of it and go back to our key words so we can follow this here. So he dreamed. And that, again, we'll go back to the night and sleep and dreaming. He has this dream here, and he'll have another dream here about the colors of the sheep. But Laban is reported to have a dream as well. And so all this whole unit is going to be negotiated by theophonic dreams, as we'll see. We'll put keywords up here. So ladder. Ladder is a translation here, and that's the one thing that scholars can agree it's not. And I have to admit that my own view has been changed by recent scholarship here. When I wrote Come Out My People and published in 2010, but this section written a few years earlier, I had followed the then prevailing consensus that this was an imitation of a Babylonian ziggurat, which would really make it a parallel story to the Tower of Babel. But more recent scholarship has shown otherwise. And I'll go down to my note here to walk us through a little bit of that. So the word here is, the word here is sulam, only here in the Bible. And the question is, what is the verbal root? And is it a verbal root from Hebrew? Is it a verbal root from Akkadian? Because the Akkadian root here, samoltu, means steps. And that's what's led many people to see it as like a ramp or something from a ziggurat. And you can see an image of that here. In the Septuagint, it has the word climax, from which, of course, we get the English word climax, but it's only there once in First Maccabees and also in Second Esdras, so it's not enough of a context to determine a meaning. As Gottlieb Zornberg notes, whatever we think of it being, it's an ironically mechanical prop for our angels not meant to fly. Although she says it rhetorically because angels so far in Genesis were not meant to fly. We saw them in chapter 19 as the visitors in Sodom, and they had the power to cast blindness on people, but we don't ever see them flying. But then we have two different views. So Michael Oblath argued over 2 decades ago now for gate, as in a city gate through which the angels pass, and that was a strong argument for a while. But more recently, Ellen von Wolde argues in a deep semantic analysis that the root sulam is used to mark a city's access road, conceived of as a descent road established from top to bottom, and therefore she offers this translation. Behold, a descent road was constructed downward to the earth, its top touching the heaven. Behold, messengers of the gods, Elohim there, were going up and down on it. Behold, Yahweh positioned himself on it. And so a descent road may seem very strange in comparison to a ladder. But as I thought about this further, I realized I think she's exactly right. Because here's a picture of the archaeological remains of the town Lachish, which is not far from Jerusalem and is established as the second most important city to Jerusalem in the monarchical period. And it's mentioned a few times in 2 Kings around the reign of Hezekiah, who has famously tried to burn down the gates of it in order to stop what he perceived as non-Yahwistic worship. I won't call it pagan, as many scholars do, because pagan is from a Roman term that isn't appropriate here in the Hebrew Bible context, but certainly non-Yahwistic worship. And you can see from this archaeological scene that what you're looking at here is the ascent road up to the city. And so a great possibility of what we're seeing here in this story, and especially in the second part of it that we'll look at next time around Josiah and Bethel, is that what's being contrasted is the ascent road up to Jerusalem and the idea that that's the place where Yahweh is, or this ascent road up to the sky, for a God whose messengers come up and down, move easily between the sky above, like in Genesis 1, when God is above the rakia, the dome, but also in the garden where you can hear the footsteps. So both in theological terms, a transcendent God who's above and beyond creation, and the immanent God who's within and among creation. And that's what we're seeing here as an alternative to Jerusalem and its institutional religion there, a God who is accessed by this ordinary person. So to finish the verse, the top of it reaching to the sky, and I want to note, if you aren't aware of it, all the way back to Genesis 1, that the Hebrew word shemayim, translated as heaven, simply means the sky. It's the place from which the rain and the snow come and where the sun is. And so Genesis does not have a sense of what we might call, from a word from a very different cultural context, a metaphysical alternative realm. It certainly has a sense that God has a realm beyond the dome that is not visible to humans. But what we hear when we hear heaven here is simply the sky. And so angels of God ascending and descending here. Only here the Greek is an perfect indicative, although we hear the echo in John 1:51 where it's a participle here. Given angelic associations is responsible for nations and territories, certainly comes out in Deuteronomy that John Patmos is called to address his message to the angels of the ecclesiae. Rashi, the great medieval midrashist, notes as an attractive idea that the ascending angels are responsible for Jacob's homeland and the descending ones for the foreign lands to which he's going. Thus, quote, this vision of the angels is an assurance of God's protection of Jacob even though he is leaving home, which also implies the protection of the exiles on the way to Babylon, who were not Israelites but Judahites, and that's going to be a big issue that we'll explore in these chapters as they unfold. So let's go down a little further and hear what the message is that Jacob hears out of this image here. And as we do, I want to note that what we're seeing on the right side of the screen here in this column is the exact verbatim what we see over here in the biblical section. But we see here is a pastiche of verses, not in the verse order in the book, but in the verse order of what we see here, showing as close as I could the parallels to what was offered to Abraham and what was offered to Isaac from the voice of God, whether that's Yahweh or Elohim. And I note that for scholars who try to divide this up into various pieces, most classically in recent work from David's Carr book called The Fractures of Genesis, highlighting a whole series of separate pieces they purport to separate out into different sources from different time periods with different theologies. I think this section is one of the strongest pieces against that whole enterprise, because we hear Yahweh saying, I am Yahweh, the Elohim of your father Abraham and the Elohim of Isaac. In other words, it seems plain, if you don't have the source theory in mind, that the writers of Genesis do not mind at all interchanging Yahweh and Elohim in various ways. And while there may be sources behind them at some point, I'm not going to suggest that that's not so. It almost provides no insight to do that, and much more insight to read it as the final author or editor, whoever that was, put it in here in a completely coherent form. And so that's what I'll continue to do here. As my note below says, God's blessing comes after the parental one. And as I was noting, when we looked at the whole scene of the so-called stealing of the blessing from Esau by Jacob with the help of his mother, but also perhaps with the help of his father, the words from Isaac were completely meaningless. They have no power at all. And so perhaps what's being contrasted here is not only the fact that fighting over paternal blessings that are meaningless is a waste of time and energy and alienated the brothers from each other, when the only blessing that is real and matters is the one that we hear right here from the Creator God. Similarly, perhaps the argument is that the Jerusalem temple and its elite attempt to crush everything around it that isn't it, including worship of Yahweh in other places, as we'll see in the next video, is as equally futile and equally meaningless when God can be experienced anywhere and everywhere by everyone. And so here we hear it. And so, as so often omitting Vehenna, behold, and so I have that in the key words, how that comes up as a key word. We see the behold, behold, behold 4 times in this immediate scene here. But I didn't put that, I just put the literal translation here. So Yahweh stood beside him, and even that is a little misleading. The term here for alive means stood on, and it's exactly the same as what we hear in Pharaoh's dream in chapter 41, verse 1, that Joseph is called upon to interpret, that Pharaoh is standing on the Nile. The translation in the NORSV says by the Nile, because it makes no sense to have him standing on the Nile, but it's a dream. And standing on indicates dominion, power over. And so as Pharaoh stood over the Nile, Yahweh stands over Jacob, exercising dominion. And the first instance here of I am is in contrast with this one here. You see the little ABA chiasm, and here I didn't set that out, but there it is, the I am and the description in the middle. So this I am is ani, the simple form of I, but this I am is anoki, the stronger form of I. And as the note here has, it conveys the notion of a God who is immanent, close and personal to each and every one of his creatures. So we'll see both are expressed here. So I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham, your father. Notice not Isaac, your father, who is obviously literally your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. And note the back and forth here between Eretz and Adamah here. So Eretz is usually the word for land. And we'll see also, as you can see in the key words here, translated separately, ground here, which is Adamah, which is we hear what the human is made out of back in Genesis 2. So there it's translated ground, and I translated ground there, and as land here. So land is something you build on, and ground is something you plant in or walk on. So land on which you lie here, which he currently is doing, I will give to you and your offspring, or your seed, and notice offspring 3 times as well in there. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, the afar, the topsoil that humans were made out of in chapter 2, verse 7. And as Gottlieb Zornberg notes again, the lowly nature of the image contrasts with the image of heavenly ascent. But the exact same language you see is back here. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread, using the verb perts here, which is hard to pronounce without the vowel. But as Gottlieb Zornberg again notes, it has explosive, even destructive implications. Other times it's translated things like burst out. And so the comparison is like dandelion seeds being blown on. The seeds will spread abroad in all the directions. They did not have standard words for directions like we have, and so they have a couple of them as descriptors, as you see down below. So to the west is Yama, the sea, and Vakerama in front, Vetsafna, north, and Vanegeb here, the Negeb, or the south, or the desert. And so all those directions, just like we saw for Abraham back there. So all directions, and all the mishpahot of the earth, using a rare word here. I mean, it's a common word elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for the basic unit beyond the Beit Ab, the father's house, and beneath the Shevet, the tribe. So the extended family and clan level of people that's being described here as the basic unit of society. And that's part of Genesis' egalitarian, non-hierarchical structure that doesn't need the abstractions of tribes or nations, even though it said 2 nations are in your womb. It's not claiming that's God's will, it's just claiming that's what will happen. And we'll see, of course, it has happened. So all the mishpahot of the earth, and exactly as 12:3, which we see here, shall be blessed in you and in your seed. And then finally, we see the end of the verse here. And as my note from Westerman has, the promise and the experience of the holy linked. Thus there are brought together these 2 basic religious phenomena, which from then on determine between them the history and religion of the people of God, history and worship respectively. And he compares Isaiah's phrase, the Holy One of Israel. These two basic phenomena remain in vital tension with each other. And I think that's a really important point, even though much of what Westerman says is now dated because of the kind of narrow historical critical method he practiced in the 1980s when he was working on this. But I think this is a really important point, that the experience and the historical journey are both part of it. So each generation has to have a new experience, and that's what we see here. It isn't simply enough that a father or a grandparent can tell a child, believe in the God that I experienced. There has to be experience. And if you've had trouble raising your children in whatever religion you practice, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, you may know that it's so important that, like in many indigenous traditions, you just send your children out to the wilderness to have the experience rather than try to convey ideas into their heads without the experience. So the Hebrew biblical tradition always includes that both, a direct sense of encounter across each generation, individually and collectively, and the tradition that we know as the Bible. So, and behold, it doesn't say no here, behold, I am with you, using the stronger form of Enochi, as I noted earlier, and will keep you. Using the word that is on the responsibility of humans to keep commandments, but here it's I will keep you. And notice the connection back to the charge of the Adam back there, to keep. So many connections back to earlier in Genesis. Wherever you go, or in the Septuagint, and Tehodo, in the way, and will bring you back to this land. And this is so important because Jacob's journey will be sidetracked and will not quite come back to this land in chapter 34, and will cause a great painful violence that we'll see. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you, which suggests counterintuitively and counter-theologically, will Yahweh leave you after he's done what he has promised? Plainly not. Translated elsewhere as forsaken, and that's plainly the point, that Yahweh will be with Jacob until what Yahweh has done has been fulfilled. And what we're seeing is going to be throughout this unit, either explicitly or implicitly, the relation between what God's will is and God's doing and what human doing is a dynamic tension that can never be resolved, but is always going to be a tension. And we'll see more of that as Jacob wakes from his dream and decides to name the place. See you that for next time. Bye-bye.